So this morning, I had a choice between some very familiar passages, and I decided to focus on this passage of the disciples in the storm and Jesus coming to them. And I think this is just a passage about which a lot of things could be said. And in fact, this is a passage about which a lot of things have been said. And it is always tempting to fall into those sort of interpretive ruts that have us focusing on questions like, would I get out of the boat? Would I keep walking if I was so brave to get out of the boat? Would I have sunk down in despair? Ironically, some of the preaching that I've heard on this passage teaches me to take my eyes off Jesus and put Peter in the center, or myself, which is exactly the mistake that Peter made. Isn't that funny? So let's take a look at what's going on in this story. We have a pretty good idea of the setting. Some of you have just been to Israel, so you have a very good idea of what the setting is. The Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long, a little shorter than Canandaigua Lake. And yet it's 8 miles across instead of 1.5 like Canandaigua. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level, which is a weird thing. It's the lowest freshwater lake in the world. In fact, it's the second lowest lake in the world after the Dead Sea. But not only is it very low, the hills around it rise up like 1,200 feet. So this means that the wind whips storms up very frequently, because as the air cools in the evening, as we all know, the air sinks and it comes through the hills and the canyons down toward the lake, but the water, as we know, cools less quickly. So there's warm air rising up off the water, and there's cold air meeting it from all these angles, and storms whip up. Jesus certainly knew this was the case about this lake, right? He grew up less than 20 miles from the Lake of Galilee. And his disciples, especially the fishermen, also knew this about the lake. But it's not just the physical setting that's important here. The circumstances that they're facing matter. At the beginning of the chapter, Matthew 14, we have Matthew's account of John the Baptist's murder. We know that the killing of John was provoked by Herod's upset wife and her animosity toward John. But from Herod's side, it's just senseless violence that trivialized John's humanity and his mission and silenced his voice. Jesus hears of it, and Matthew tells us in verse 13, immediately he wants to be alone. He withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. He likely needed to grieve. John, after all, was one of his own relatives. John was also his biggest supporter, promoter even. And not only that, but John's death pointed to the probable end of Jesus' life as well, the violent end toward which Jesus' ministry tended. So Jesus is facing personal sorrow, professional loss, and a reminder of the precarious nature of his own life. He definitely needed to be alone. But the crowds find him, it says. And in his bereft state, Jesus looks out over the crowd with gut-wrenching compassion. Jesus is certainly an example here of someone who allows the pain in their own life to open them to the pain in other people's, to make him more sensitive rather than self-pitying or bitter. From the place of his own sorrow, he meets this crowd, addresses their illnesses, heals their ailments, and finally feeds them. And I wonder if he doesn't grieve for them also, because they live in this violent world with petty rulers who ignore their suffering and carelessly crush their lives. But he still needs to be alone, and he works to create more solitude for himself. Is he being selfish? Nope, just realistic. Grief needs to be acknowledged, waded into, lived with, lived through. I'm sure this isn't the only time when Jesus was feeling sorrow about John's death, because grief, after all, is a long process for all of us. But it's the clearest indication that Jesus took his own grief seriously. He needed to grieve and pray and get his footing in this new reality of life without John on this earth. And so if we ever needed permission as Christians to grieve the loss of people who are dear to us, here it is, the example of Jesus. So Jesus sends his disciples away. It's an interesting point, since they had been involved in the feeding of the 5,000 and the women and children along with them in the prior story. They were integral to the action. They gathered up the puny provisions, they passed out the loaves and the fish, they gathered up the extra. So they might have assumed that Jesus needed their help. Jesus might not be able to send these crowds away on his own. But Jesus not only didn't need it, he didn't want it. And he made them, or the verb is he compelled them to get into a boat, even though it's late evening. Did Jesus know a storm would come up? He certainly knew it was a possibility, and so did they, the ones who had spent their professional lives on this lake. When they're off to the boat, Jesus also sends the crowds away. The crowd who had just gotten a free supper. The crowd that in John's gospel we find out was so excited about the free food they wanted to make Jesus king. But maybe the crowd is not just glad for the food, maybe they're also restive. The most popular preacher, prophet in the country has just been put to death by a weak political ruler. Did they want to avenge John's death? If any of them were tempted to storm Herod's compound, Jesus tames the impulse. Did Jesus need to calm them down and didn't think that the impulsive Peter or James and John, the sons of thunder, would help the situation? Or maybe Jesus knew they were simply heartbroken because John had been beloved by the crowds. He symbolized God's presence, God's attention, God speaking to them after hundreds of years of silence. But more than that, he saw them. He preached against the oppression of the poor. He called out the corruption of leaders who wanted to use John's ministry and his popularity for their own ends. You might remember his stellar evangelistic technique. Who warned you to flee the wrath to come, you brood of vipers? But I think those words resonated with the downtrodden. Here was someone who spoke truth to power, and now he's been publicly, brutally executed. And I think we may have here a MLK level of public grief. It would be interesting to know what Jesus said to them to get them to go with their grief or their anger and their lostness, their need for a shepherd. But they leave, and Jesus climbs to a nearby mountain to be alone. 3 times, Matthew tells us that Jesus is alone or by himself. Even the Son of God, who came to earth to do an enormous mission in about 3 years, took time to be alone. So if we can't take a break from work or any other aspect of our hectic lives to be alone with ourselves and be alone before God, we may be implicitly assuming that our work is more important than the work of Jesus. Anyway, he goes up a mountain, and the mountain, as you likely know, mountains were a place in the Old Testament for people to go and meet God, whether it's Abraham and Isaac or Moses, Elijah. Matthew 2 underscores mountains as a place of encountering God and hearing the kingdom proclaimed. The Sermon on the Mount of Transfiguration, the final commissioning in chapter 28 on a mountain. Jesus goes up a mountain to commune with the Father and the Spirit within the beloved community of the Trinity. From evening until just before dawn, Jesus is on the mountain, and the disciples are on a turbulent sea. Matthew tells us that they were far from land, and that the wind is against them or tormenting them. It's hard to make progress when the wind is against you, particularly if you only have one sail. And what scholars think boats were like, fishing boats that they were, one of which they were probably on at this point, about 27 feet long, 10, 15 fishermen could be on the boat at the same time. But it would have one square sail. So if you're sailing against the wind, you have to tack this way and tack that way to make even a tiny bit of progress. Finally, in verse 25, in the fourth watch of the night, which is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus shows up. They've not only sailed all night, stayed up all night long sailing, they're likely exhausted from constant exertion, drenched from the water spraying into the boat, maybe famished from all that effort. Until this point, though, Matthew doesn't say they're afraid. They're not fearful of this storm the way they were in a prior story where Jesus is asleep in the boat, they think they're going to die, and they're afraid. They're not afraid in this story until they see Jesus. What is it? A ghost! And they cry out. And the word here for cry out is to croak, cry like a raven, cry aloud. One scholar said maybe squawk is the closest English equivalent, implying panic that loses all dignity. Yes. Jesus is not simply showing them, though, his power, or as one preacher put it, his aquatic acrobatic abilities, but he's touching some deep assumptions in Jewish thought. In Hebrew scriptures, the sea connoted forces of chaos that threatened, that were held in check only by God. The deep is a symbol of forces against God, and so Jesus coming to them, walking on the sea, is surmounting the chaos, is trampling the chaos. Biblical scholar Eugene Boring observes that when thinking about Jesus walking on water, the modern mind thinks of defying the law of gravity. That's what we're hung up on. How could he do it? The biblical mind thinks of the one who overcomes the power of chaos. From the Epic of Gilgamesh onward, he says it was a commonplace in ancient thought that no human being could perform this feat. It was reserved for the deity. So for instance, in Job 9:8, it says, God alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Or in Psalm 89, the psalmist exclaims, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Jesus comes to them doing something that only God can do. But they don't notice it right away. They're way too overwhelmed. So Jesus speaks to comfort them. And his first words, take heart. Things look overwhelming, but all is not lost. Like he says in John 16, I've told you these things so that you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Gird up your heart. Have courage. But it's more than that. Live in your heart, through your heart, having a heart that's alive. Listen to the core of your heart. Some people over-identify their intuitions as the movement of God. Maybe you've met them. God told me this, God told me that. But there's also the assumption on the other side to fail to listen to the longings and the movements of our own hearts. In the swirling dramas of our own life situations that we can't seem to fix, or the pressures of external expectations that are actually there, or the ones we put on ourselves that threaten to make us despair, we are supposed to take heart. But there's more. Not only does Jesus show himself supreme over the sea, as well as present to them in their danger, Not only does he encourage them with the words, take heart and don't be afraid, but he identifies himself. It is I. Ego eimi. I am. And it is I is a good English translation. That's how we talk. But to the Jewish ears of Jesus' disciples, and we all remember that all his disciples were Jewish at this point, the echo of the divine name would be impossible to miss. And the same goes for Matthew's Jewish audience as well. Jesus is doing something only God can do, winning out over the deep, and now explicitly links himself to the divine by using the special name for God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Jesus is the I am who can effectively subdue the powers of chaos. Take heart, the I am is here with you. But we do have to talk about Peter. Good old Peter, doing and saying the unexpected, and in cases like this seemingly crazy. I mean, how would walking on water help him understand the identity of Jesus? And what in the world would compel somebody even to ask that of Jesus in the middle of a storm? Tell me to get out of the boat. Let alone the irony. Peter uses an imperative verb to command Jesus to command him to get out of the boat. Wow. Because Peter's intentions are not spelled out, though, there are lots of speculations about his motives and whether it was even a good thing that he wanted to get out of the boat. Some have noted this phrase, if it is you, is like other times in the Gospels when people doubt the identity of Jesus. For instance, Satan in chapter 4, while Jesus is being tempted, if you're the Son of God, the high priest at Jesus' trial, if you think you're so special, the mockers at the cross, yeah, you saved other people, if you have all that power, save yourself. But in each of these cases, they want Jesus to do something in order to verify his identity, which is not a good thing, of course. But I don't think that's what Peter is up to here, especially because Jesus met Peter's request. Peter had a real longing for being with Jesus, unlike the sneering crowds at the cross. In fact, at the other end of the spectrum, there are folks who suggest that Peter's words shouldn't be translated, if it's you, but since it's you, bid me to come to you on the water. Given that Jesus granted Peter's request, we can assume he wasn't trying to just get Jesus to prove his identity. The early church preacher John Chrysostom suggested that Peter asked for what he did for love only and not for display. He didn't say, Chrysostom continues, bid me walk on the water, rather bid me come to thee, for none so loved Jesus. In this reading, Peter already believes it's Jesus. And he knows the safest place to be is standing with Jesus, even if it means entering more deeply into the storm. I think this is a much more compelling way to read this passage. Peter's request as an expression of faith, acting on his trust that Jesus is powerful enough to help him and loving enough to grab him if something goes wrong. Peter's not trying to act better than the other disciples, and he's not trying to claim he's equal with Jesus walking on the water. He's just trying to be with Jesus, longing to be with him. Not a quest for security, but a quest for presence. In any case, Jesus had already challenged them to live with courage, take heart, first sending them across the lake to face whatever weather they were going to face, and now granting Peter's desire to get out of the boat. Jesus calls us not to a life of impetuous foolishness, but of growing confidence in God. What does that mean for us, especially those of us very accustomed to building security and even predictability into our lives? God does not demand that I step out of airplanes, as one preacher put it, but like Peter, I can step forward even if the ground beneath me is no more substantial than water. Obviously, it doesn't mean completely expunging fear and reluctance from our hearts. We know that courage is only possible while we also are afraid. It simply means a willingness to risk, to swing your leg over that proverbial side of the boat with no guarantees about what will happen. And let's face it, there are few guarantees in life. Very few when it comes to a loving relationship. It all involves risk. But we all know what happens. Despite Peter's initial success, he gets spooked by the wind, which is saying a lot for somebody who has spent hours, maybe years of his life out on this lake. He begins to sink. When he cries out, Jesus reaches out and saves him. I think we're supposed to think that they're close enough by this point that Jesus can just reach out and save him. The thing is, though, that Jesus still responds. He still calls him. He still reaches out to save him, even when the wind terrifies. The compassion of one who fed the crowds is then exhibited toward his disciples. He joins them in the storm, and now he has compassion on Peter and reaches out. This, too, is a familiar action of God in the Old Testament. God stretches out his hand to deliver his people from oppression in Egypt. God stretches out his hand to save people from exile. This is the Creator who stretches out his hand to save. One of the most comforting parts of this whole story, in fact, that God reaches out to us to save us. Not when we have everything together, but when we don't. Regardless of Peter's motives, even, for getting out of the boat, regardless of the fact that he later panics, Jesus reaches out and grabs him, gets him back into the boat, calms the wind. Even though he speaks the words, "Oh, you of little faith," just as he did in the earlier storm story, he is saving Peter, saving them all. When I was younger, I always thought this was a little bit unfair. Why does Peter get called a "you of little faith" when he was the only one brave enough to get out of the boat, right? But now I hear these words of Jesus differently. "You of little faith" may not be a reprimand and a put down as much as a statement. If you had kept pedaling, you would have succeeded. You know, when you're learning and you're swerving around like we were talking with the kids, you're not reprimanding a child when you say, "Oh, you should have kept pedaling." You're just making a statement of fact. If you had held on to your faith, you would have been okay, but it's okay because I got you. I think sometimes we use this story, and in fact lots of biblical stories, in a mechanistic kind of way. If you have enough faith, then God does this thing. Kind of like, when the fire department is raising money and they have those posters with the thermometer, and when you get a little money, you color in the bottom, and then you color more and more, to show that when you get to the top, some great thing is going to happen. But is that really what Jesus is saying here or anywhere? I mean, sometimes he does say, "Your faith has made you well," but sometimes he just says, "So what do you want me to do for you? Do you believe I can do this? I believe, but help my unbelief." And Jesus still heals the guy's son. Jesus never says, "Okay, well, when you ratchet up your faith to a certain amount, get back to me and we'll talk about that thing you want." That's what we do to ourselves. But this is a love relationship and not a bank transaction. The good news is that even though Peter falters and the rest of the disciples cower in the boat, they're still making progress with Jesus. They likely wouldn't have recognized this progress at the time, but their response in this story is different from that prior story when Jesus was asleep in the boat and they thought they were going to die. In that story, Jesus also says, "Oh, you little faith." And he stills the wind, and the disciples are wondering, who is this that can even still the wind and the waves? But in this story, did you catch what they say at the end? "Truly, you are the Son of God." Wow. We have here the gradual unfolding of Jesus' identity and the gradual growing awareness that the people around Jesus have about who he is. A couple chapters later, when Jesus asks, "Whom do people say I am, and whom do you say I am?" And Peter comes out with that declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Yeah, nobody could have revealed that to you, only the Spirit." But I wonder if that showing didn't start right here when Jesus was grabbing him from the waves. Faith, as we know it, is not an on-off switch, but a process, a journey, a lifetime of growth. It takes a lifetime to say, "I knew you well," says this old song. And if that's true of a human person, how much more true of the mysterious and powerful God over all creation? It's not, as one of my friends says, convincing ourselves that we're convinced of something, but it's the choosing to follow and confirming that choice with all the subsequent choices. You could say that this story suggests God not only responds to our deepest longings and needs, but also that God invites us to a more adventurous life of faith. God wants more for us than we ever dream, right? We know that. More for us than simply safety and stability. Even those are really important, particularly in some eras of our lives. God calls us to stretch and to grow, to live into that abundant life that God promised, trusting that God is always with us. And this applies to us as the church as well. In fact, there's a long tradition in interpreting the boat in this story to be a symbol of the church, tossed about on the chaos and the waves, that Jesus comes and helps. In fact, churches, the long part of a worship area is called a nave in traditional churches, which comes from the Latin word for boat, navis. It's a great image because it says we're all in this together, that Jesus comes, not just to Peter. Jesus comes to us all. Jesus joins us in the boat. Jesus helps us move together toward the shore. When the winds die down, he'll have something for us to do on the other side. So ultimately, this is a story about Jesus. This is a story about the divine I am striding the waves, overcoming chaos, and then reaching out to his faltering disciples. Jesus says 3 things. Take heart, don't despair, keep living your actual life. Secondly, take heart because I, the divine I am, is with you. Even when you're not aware of it, he's steady to reach out and to save us from the things that threaten to bring us down. And finally, don't be afraid to move forward in your life and live with courage and hope. Follow Jesus into the suffering of this world. Be his hands and feet of compassion. Let's welcome Jesus into the rocking boat so he can bring peace. May this story be a picture of us sailing in this boat called the church across the lake to whatever Jesus has for us. As the old hymn writer put it, Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of life's wild, restless sea. Not out of it, but into it. Amen.